I lost my pen.
You can borrow mine.
Thanks.
I lost something once. I lost something I couldn't live without. My identity.
What happened to Warrior? This guy did a post called "What Happened to Warrior?" I was reading through it and I thought to myself, you know what? Let's talk about this. So what happened to Warrior? Cards with no archetypes, existing nerf cards, too much archetype, and if you have dilemma. But I will say, before we even get to this, I will probably add a ton of more insight, at least from my perspective, of what actually is happening with Warrior. Also, hold on, did he make him cry? Oh yeah, there's a little tear there. So this is the first really big issue with Warrior, right? Cards with no archetype. Provides very little support to help the meta, either niche cards or one-off cards with no further archetype support. This is basically a common thing that Hearthstone has been doing for a very long time, more with Shaman than any other class. Shaman's usually like this one class that either goes full totem or they're doing wacky stuff for an entire expansion. Warrior just has cards, and that's not good in Hearthstone anymore. Hearthstone generally is getting a really good strategy and winning a game, and Warrior just doesn't have that anymore. Now you might be asking yourself, Rarran, what the hell happened to Warrior that it's in this position? So Warrior and Fraction Alterac Valley got some pretty interesting cards overall. Like a card like Hit Very Hard, it's fine. When's an actual time you saw someone put this into your deck, right? Same thing with Shoulder Check. A lot of these cards feel like they're very just whatever until you get to a card like this. Frozen Buckler, which supports the control archetype for Warrior. Now the control archetype for Warrior is probably the most prominent one. When you think of Warrior, I often think about Control Warrior, other than Pirate Warrior, but I try to repress that memory because, you know, it scarred me during those times. And that generally seems to be where Warrior wants to be. Its whole hero power is kind of based around getting tanky. So when you print a card like Frozen Buckler, it's easier just to be like, oh, Warrior's going to be control this time. And in Voyage of the Sunken City, they ended up nerfing Shield Shatter. And they nerfed Shield Shatter because Warrior at the time was too oppressive as Control Warrior. I don't know about you guys. It feels like Hearthstone is trying really, really hard to make sure that control and lengthy games aren't the most prominent deck in Hearthstone anymore. People often don't like to play against very long control decks, and we saw this recently with Blood Death Knight being very, very popular and people heavily complaining about it. That's the loud minority, but I guarantee a lot of people who play this game casually don't really want to play against those long games either. Most people want to go like in and out, couple Hearthstone games here and there, and then they move on. So after this expansion, when we go to Voyage into the Sunken City, Warrior kind of got a lot of nonsense, I want to say. There's not a lot of cards in this whole set that really feel like they work together, except for one, From the Depths. Now, this card used to be really good. This was basically Warrior's biggest win condition after Shield Shatter was nerfed, because at least Warrior had a way to cheat mana, get ahead on board, and then actually have a way to win a game. But here's the problem with this card. Mana cheating is not super great to play with, and it doesn't really feel really good when you lose to this because your opponent just played a card, they drew it, and then you lost the game. So I understand why they decided to nerf it. It can be a very toxic card, but this basically was the last win condition for Warrior other than, not this card, other than Nelly, which they have drastically changed over the course of last year because this card was very, very good. When we go to Murder in Castle Nathria, what did Warrior really get? Kind of nothing. A bunch of cards that do absolutely nothing. I mean, and Rage Warrior is an archetype, but a lot of these cards just feel very uninspired. I think, and this is my conspiracy theory, I think that the Lich King and the Death Knight class took so much creativity from the Warrior class, because Death Knight is basically what Warrior wants to do as a control deck, but it's just arguably better. The only real advantage that Warrior had over Death Knight is the armor. But recently, if you type armor into the search category, you will notice that Druid has a ton of armor cards, where Warrior, as much as it has armor, they don't have good armor cards. So Warrior has taken this really weird design process of not being super great for what the class has always been, but also they don't really have interesting design anymore when they're giving the armor aspect to Druid and the control archetype to the Lich King or Death Knight class. How do you design Warrior? Well, you design interesting archetype, or you design cards that hopefully fit the Warrior theme, and at the same time form a coherent deck. Where's the coherent deck? That's basically it. And that's what this guy's basically saying in the first one, is that I think designing cards for warrior has become so much harder with the fact that they want to give druid armor, and Death Knight was being built and being designed while they were still making sets for this class. I don't really know how they will do control warrior when Death Knight is in the game, and Death Knight is arguably just more interesting to play than just armor up every single turn. That leads us to Enrage Warrior. Enrage Warrior is, I believe it's still a pretty good deck at the moment. Hold on. Where's Enrage Warrior? So if you look at the list, so Enrage Warrior is tier 3, Menagerie Warrior, Control Warrior is tier 4. It's not looking super great for Warrior. It's looking pretty rough, unfortunately. So are they forced to make Warrior just this Enrage, like maybe mid-range deck? We kind of talked about this, but the problem with these type of cards is mana cheating is not generally a great win condition for Hearthstone. From the Depths is extremely popular in Nelly's Pirate Ship. What it used to be, they cost 1. It was really, really unfortunate to play against. I seriously doubt that they will unnerf these cards. This is probably the one that I think is the most interesting. I'm really glad this person brought this up because I feel the exact same way about Shaman a lot of the time. Warrior has way too many archetypes currently. What generally happens with classes that have too many archetypes is that they falter because there's not a good enough deck. They don't have a good density of cards for each archetype to actually build something worth building. The bigger problem with this is that most of the warrior archetypes that they have gotten are kind of just not great, and they don't really fit together even as independent archetypes trying to mesh into one bigger archetype. Every single warrior page feels like it's just a bunch of cards put together. It's almost like a neutral set for warrior. It's really, really weird. When Festival of Legends, they really push this menagerie archetype, and with the menagerie archetype, it is much more about being like a neutral class than it is about warrior, because you could definitely be like, oh, warrior has a ton of ways of making menagerie good, but if you look at the current deck list, most of the cards in this deck list are actually neutral. They're not even warrior. Like I think like the first 10 cards here are all neutral. It makes it feel even worse as a warrior player because warrior doesn't really have an identity because it's dipping so hard into the neutral pool just to make a playable archetype from the cards that it received. I've been saying this a lot, but I kind of refer to this as like the shaman problem, where shaman often bounces from being really good or being really bad. There's not really an in-between for shaman, unfortunately, because the bigger problem with shaman is that shaman often gets these really weird archetypes that don't really work together, and then they just stop printing for them. A lot of these are just super mid-range type of decks that just fight for the board in the mid game, and then hopefully that's enough to win. It doesn't feel like warrior has a really great win condition other than Blackrock. The problem with this card, if it's too good, it's awful to play against, and if it's bad, it doesn't feel great to play because you're spending 5 mana to do nothing, but in theory the payoff should be very worth it. But in reality, if it goes to 3 mana or it goes to 4 mana, even at 4 mana, I don't know about 4 mana, but definitely at like 3 mana, this card becomes a serious problem, and you don't want that to be in the game. It's just like when they nerf this card. When it's too cheap, it's annoying and frustrating to play against, but when it's too expensive, it just doesn't feel good to play with. This person who made the Reddit post calls this if you have dilemma, and that basically is there are too many requirements set on a bundle of cards, limits the free playability and also the choice of deck building. So because the Hearthstone team has tried to make warrior do all of these little archetypes, none of these archetypes really synergize well together because they all want to do their own thing, which makes it even harder to build for warrior. And I think the best example of this is Burden of Pride with the Moss Swarm, right? This card wants you to gain armor, well, this card wants you to lose health. How do you do that? The Drum Solace, it wants you to have no other minions so it gets a buff, but at the same time, you want to summon more minions with the Brute. Something doesn't really seem like it's working out here, right? But I think the biggest problem with Warrior Chat, talking about at the start of this, that I think the Lich King has definitely ruined the class in some way. Death Knight is Control Warrior, just designed differently and more modern. So when they look at Control, they obviously want to make Death Knight the most popular version of it because it's the new class. You're not said in your patient video that class has lost their identity. I think that's the most apparent with Warrior. I think that's completely fair. And you can see this actually with a lot of different classes, right? Like I appreciate Blizzard trying different stuff. The best classes currently in this game are the ones that can use multiple cards for different archetypes. And again, I can prove that right now with Vicious Syndicate. If we look at Vicious Syndicate and we look at what the best decks are currently, Unholy Aggro Death Knight, Spell Demon Hunter, these 3 at the top all use cards that support different archetypes in that class, which is absolutely fantastic because that makes deck building so much more interesting. There's so many different options. But when you look at Warrior, you can't really build a deck like that. It is kind of lost. It's lost in the sauce is pretty much what I'm saying. Warrior's drunk and it needs to go home. How do you fix this problem? I have no idea. I don't even know where you begin with this. I think legitimately they have to start thinking really outside the box for the warrior class. The best warrior deck recently has been kind of the Enrage package, and most of it has come from Castle Nathir, right? Anima Extractor is a really good example of Enrage and why it could be really, really good. There's a lot of tempo. They also printed the weapon, the Imbued Axe, which really helps the Enrage package. But dude, problem with the Enrage package is that we've seen it way too much recently. And I'm going to talk to this just quickly as a Warlock main. Warlock had a lot of interesting archetypes over the past year, right? We had Murlocs and Curses in the first one. Castle Nathir, we had the Imp package and some kind of like, I don't really know what this archetype would be called, but it's like the Shadow Spell package. The Lich King, they got big undead demons, right? Three different ways to play Warlock that all kind of still fit the flavor of the class, but they're all doing different stuff to make the cards feel unique. Each time I played Warlock in all of these expansions, it felt like a brand new deck to play. Recently with Warrior, it has felt like every single deck that they introduce has felt the exact same. And that's why people just think that Warrior's so boring and that Enraged Warrior is just kind of whatever, is people don't want to play it anymore, right? You make Control a good archetype again. But that's what I was saying at the beginning of this. I'm pretty sure they don't want to make Control great, and they already have their premier Control deck with Death Knight, right? They don't want multiple Control decks. They want one good Control deck and Priest, but we don't have to talk about Priest. Even if you buff a lot of the cards, like if Enraged Warrior was tier 1, I don't think like people really want to play it. Now, do I think the mini set can fix it is a great question. Yes. Because I think the bigger problem with Warrior at the moment is not stats and mana cost. It's just strictly cards that they have in the game, right? Warrior needs a really cool win condition. Warrior needs a way to actually win a game that's not just let me damage my minions and fight for board. They could do a brand new mechanic for Warrior like they did with Priest this year. Like Priest got overheal. Warrior needs something that makes it more inspired. And if they don't get a good card, if they don't get a couple of really good cards in the mini set, Warrior is actually going to be the most boring class for basically the entire year. Maybe Warrior should just have charge. I think that would be kind of interesting. I'm not really sure how they do it. To basically sum this whole thing up, I think Warrior got too many bad archetypes that don't work together. There's not a critical mass of good cards in the Warrior class for me to really want to play it at all. I think the design of Death Knight with Blood has really stopped Warrior from being the control class. It makes it really awkward to design control cards for Warrior because they definitely do not want two really big control classes in the metagame. We saw how many people were complaining on Reddit and on Twitter about Blood being broken and just unfun to play against. They definitely don't want that, especially because that's the small minority of the game, or the loud minority of the game speaking up about it. Imagine all the people who play like 1 or 2 games a day, all they do is play against control. There's no way they want to do that again. Keep nerfing tier 1 decks. If they keep nerfing tier 1 decks, the problem with that is that Warrior's still not that interesting to play, because Enraged Warrior was actually a really good deck in the previous expansion. No one wanted to play it because it's boring. Like, we need something cool. We need something interesting. Dude, this is a card that I think should be in the core set. I'm really surprised it's not, because it fits the Menagerie package so well, right? Like, this is an example of they want to make Warrior a little bit more interesting with Menagerie. Why not just add this to the core set? You know what I mean? The other big problem is that Warrior basically has 3 sets of expansions where the deck just feels really bad, right? In Voyage, Warrior doesn't really have any really great cards other than maybe Trench Stalker and Tidal Revenant. The other ones kind of feel bad at the moment. This card's fine. This card's also fine, but it's not like great. Same with Castle Nathir. A lot of these cards just feel really weak. So they have three sets of cards that are basically just meh. Why not bring Fire Plume's Heart for Warrior? Dude, honestly, I would 100% agree with that. You know what? That's a really good suggestion, because they did print, like, Warrior has the taunt cards, right? Like, they kind of made a whole package for Warrior here with these taunts. If they brought this card back just for a cool win condition to have, I think that'd be pretty interesting. I don't know if it'd be good in current Hearthstone, but it'd definitely be a fun way to play Warrior. Hearthstone's designed around fast fun. Basically, if you can't play a game while taking a dump, it needs to be changed in the dev's eyes. I don't know about that. Battlegrounds games last for a while. All right, I thought that's my that's the Warrior problem, at least in my perspective, chat. I don't know if that was a good video or interesting to watch, but I'm glad you guys stuck around for it.